Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic freedom. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. Politics gets pretty emotional, and we typically view that as bad. The political scene would be better, we suppose, if more people could set aside their emotions and rationally engage with the hard questions. My guest today isn't so sure. Jason Canon is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge in political science, and while he doesn't reject reason, he argues that emotion plays, or ought to play, a much larger role in how we think about and approach politics than it typically gets. Reason doesn't work without emotion, and emotions can lead us to better political outcomes. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Jason. What is political sentiment?
At its simplest, it's how we feel about politics and also how politics makes us feel. And I'm really interested in it because it captures a lot of the psychology that goes into our experience of politics. So it's not just emotion, it's also reason and all of the various parts of our identities and our brains and everything else that we bring to the public square. And in the history of political thought, certainly in the history of political science, reason has always taken the dominant role in how we think about these things. So you can think about the school of rational choice. There is no school of emotional choice. And I think that's probably no accident. Emotion has always sort of been gotten second consideration when it comes to our political lives. And I think that's a mistake. And I think it's a particular mistake in our current moment because in liberal democracies, the folks who are working to protect those institutions and principles haven't really understood the power of emotion in politics. And meanwhile, the new authoritarians have figured out how to turn it into a thermonuclear weapon. And so we need to figure out emotion and sentiment broadly, and we need to figure it out soon.
When you say it's a mistake to ignore emotion in favor of rationality, do you mean it's a mistake in the sense that emotion plays a role, and a significant one, whether we like it or not? And so, well, it might be better that we could all be rational, we can't, and we have to deal with this, and ignoring it means not being able to solve the kinds of problems that we want to, or not recognize the causes of problems that we would like to solve? Or do you mean it in the sense that by shoving emotion to the side, we're missing something important about how to make good decisions and how to understand the world, such that, like, even if we could get rid of it, it would be wrong to get rid of it?
Yeah, I think it's both. So to the first point, there are a lot of folks who just think that the worst parts of our politics come from our most emotional parts of our brains, right? And you hear this a lot from some libertarian types who think that policy should be decided purely on the most rationalistic grounds based on some sort of optimum that they've identified. And if you disagree with that, or if it bothers you in some way, then you're wrong. And also, some of them will go to the extreme of saying that would merit certain forms of disenfranchisement. So there's a way in which privileging reason, pure reason, imagining that politics could ever be run purely on rationalistic grounds, sets you up for a misunderstanding of how politics actually happens. And then I think you're also right that it's just true that when we bring our whole selves to politics, which we do often, um, there's a lot of feeling that goes into that, and a lot of it is great, right? So there's a strong literature on how emotion is actually necessary for rationality. So the whole idea of some sort of a division that we have to choose reason or emotion, that's a false dichotomy. And it just so happens that emotion is a crucial component of how we process information, about how we make moral judgments. And so we need emotion, and we need an understanding of how it works for us to have a politics that can accommodate it and use it fruitfully.
I can imagine our utilitarian friends listening to this, or our deontological friends listening to this and saying, wait a second, emotion isn't necessary for moral reasoning at all. We simply, like, if you want to do the right thing, it's not what makes you feel good. It's not emotivism. It's just adding up the consequences of your action, comparing it to alternatives, picking the one that has the best consequences, or it is taking your Kantian decision-making flowchart and stepping through each block on it until you get to right or wrong. Those seem like they're removing emotion from the equation entirely, and those are rather robust and widely accepted views of morality, both like in a descriptive and a normative sense. Are they wrong?
I tend to think so. That's why I'm so attracted by the moral sentimentalist tradition that especially comes out of the Scottish Enlightenment. But even if they're right, pure utilitarianism and pure deontology doesn't explain everyday politics. It's just not what democracy looks like. It's not what liberalism looks like day to day. So even if they're correct about the right way to make moral judgments, we have to account for what politics looks like in the real world. And in the real world, there's a lot of feeling, a lot of hot emotion, usually. And that can be used productively. Social movements draw on emotions in really important ways. Emotion is one of the constituents of motivation, full stop, right? We do things in the world because we feel certain ways and we want certain things. Things make us feel good or bad. But that's what the everyday stuff of politics looks like. So it can be good, it can be bad, it can be all sorts of things in between. But if what we want is a better lived political world, we have to include that, whatever our commitments to ethics are.
What does that mean in practice? Does it mean, because obviously anyone who has experienced the political world, say in the last 10 years, has seen the emotional, often shrilly emotional content of it. That we have populism is not entirely, but is to a great extent a political movement motivated by anger about one's social status or changing social status, and anger directed at certain categories of people who are blamed for one's status or changing status. Um, and that has swept across the globe. But that's not really a good emotion, right? And so when you're talking about like taking this stuff into account, embracing emotion, does that simply mean embracing emotion as we find it? Or is there a normative critique here that this is about saying like there are right kinds of emotions, there are wrong kinds of emotions, there are correct emotional responses, there are incorrect emotional responses, and so I guess saying like here this category of emotions we should either take seriously or give weight in our political decision making, but this set of emotions over here expressed by this group of people we should either dismiss or seek to ensure do not play an influential role in our political decision making.
I'm less interested in the normative judgment about the emotions themselves. So whether somebody should be angry about X or Y policy. And I'm more interested in how their emotional experience, their anger, their joy, their enthusiasm is getting used and channeled by political actors and political institutions. So it does seem to me that we can make claims about whether or not someone is rightly or wrongly upset about something that's happened to them. At the very least, I think we should use that as important data for how we understand the political landscape. Like, even if I think somebody is irrationally upset about a policy that I think is really important, if I want to treat them as an equal, I need to at least try my best to understand their perspective. I have to extend empathy, essentially. Where I think that our understanding is especially lacking is not so much in the study of the individual emotions, and political psychology is a flourishing field in recent decades. But it's much more an awareness of how all of that cashes out in terms of what our politicians do, what that looks like in any sort of electoral setting or deliberative setting. That's really where I feel like we don't know much. We're learning a lot more every year, but the study of that cluster of issues is still very new in the history of our understanding of the political world.
Can you give an example of an issue out there in the political world that listeners will have experienced that you think further study on the issue of political sentiment is needed, would shed light on, could help resolve, and so on?
So fear is the emotion that has gotten the most empirical analysis from political psychologists. And I think there's a good reason for that. It's something that is, alongside anger, something that is highly motivating. And it's also something that the new authoritarians have learned to tap in ways that can build and sustain coalitions. The concern that I have, and this is the place where if I had millions to just create a research agenda, I would. What I don't think we understand is how electoral institutions are affected by actors who are basically rage mongers. People who have learned to gain power by creating fear, anxiety, anger, all of these sort of cognate emotions. They use that to gain power, and then they have, over the past few decades, then used that power to undermine the institutions that allowed them to come to power in the first place. And so it's that intersection of using all of the tools of modern communications, so mass media and then social media more recently, using that to create these coalitions that are being held together in large part, not singly, but in large part based on a sort of emotional arousal and valence that gets shared among this group, and then using that to undermine liberal democratic institutions. That intersection, emotion and institution, is what I think we don't know nearly enough about today.
Why does it seem that it's negative emotions that are so motivating or so centered in this? And I say this as someone whose scholarly project for the last at least few years has been building out an argument that robust liberalism, and I mean robust in the sense that it can withstand assaults from illiberal ideologies, depends to a great extent upon a citizenry that feels positive emotions towards each other, that doesn't just tolerate each other, because toleration is at best neutral, but is typically negative. Like, you don't tend to you don't have to tolerate things that you feel good about. And so instead, figuring out how we can feel good about each other in all of our lush and dynamic diversity. But it doesn't feel like political movements built on positive feelings gain much traction. I'm thinking about the Ron Paul revolution, with the letters reverse, so love's in the middle of revolution, was popular for a while, but even Ron Paul himself has descended into very, very angry crank politics. So why does it seem to be so much easier to build and mobilize and operationalize around fear, anxiety, and so on, versus kindness, compassion, generosity, and so on?
It's a good question, and I don't know, but it strikes me that it's a pretty complex picture. So on the one hand, you do get a lot of political mobilization that happens based on the more positive sort of emotions, right? Obama's first presidential campaign was hope and change. When I'm in the UK right now, and the Labour Party is running on a platform of change. That they're not putting hope in the tagline, but change is what they're promising, and they're promising it in sort of a more hopeful vein than their competitors, even if they're not using the word. So, and when you think about social movements, especially, there are lots of ground level activities that happen because people are coming together to create good. So think of the surge in approval for an organization like Better Angels, which is explicitly trying to bring people together on really contentious issues to find places where their views overlap and where they can come to agreement. That's drawing from a real sense of civic pride and patriotism and a sense that we can make our community better. So there are lots of ways in which the more positive emotions can do a lot of good and can mobilize action. But it's a thorny problem why the cloudier emotions, the ones with the more negative valence, why they are so mobilizing. And the best thing that my running hypothesis right now is that harm matters. And our perception of harm matters. And I think that this is why the concept of harm has been so crucial to the liberal tradition over its history. And it's had a lot of really good thinkers and work that's been done on the concept. Of course, Mill sort of kicked off that research agenda, but a lot of people have followed it up since. And our perception of harm, so our perception of threats, then comes to underlie fear, anger, anxiety. And some psychologists will distinguish fear and anxiety and anger based on our perception of threats and what we think we can do about that threat, if we need to run or if we can fight or whatever. So it seems like there's something about our fear that a policy, or crucially, another group, our political opponents, our perception that they will do us harm is something that will mobilize us to act, because we think that something has to be done if, and then, fill in the blank here, but like, if this truly is the last election of our republic, or if we're going to lose our freedom, or if they're going to let so-and-so group, invade and, blah, 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 all the rest.
Is that then why so much of contemporary politics feels like it is about identifying sources of harm or creating perceptions of sources of harm? I'm thinking about someone like Chris Rufo, whose entire MO is effectively picking harmless people and largely harmless ideas, and then convincing a swath of the population that actually those things are not just harmful, but are the secret unrecognized harm that is actually behind everything bad in your life or about the country or motivating your dissatisfaction with the direction of things and so on, and then stirring up anger around it. And we can find versions of this on the left with views of markets and market actors that are secretly harming you, even if it feels like you're better off now than we used to be a generation ago or 2 generations ago or 1,000 years ago. And so is that basically an implicit conceding of your point that sentiments matter at least as much as rational arguments?
They get results, right? We have a name for these sort of things. We call them moral panics for a reason, because they create a sense of panic, of dread, of impending doom. And what all of these actors do is sort of a two-step sort of approach. On the one hand, they take this thing and they make you afraid of it, even if it will almost certainly never affect your life. Right? So think about the ways in which immigration gets discussed and, our treatment of migrants. To listen to a lot of these commentators, you would think that the migrants who cross a border are coming directly for each of our lives and livelihoods and our wives and children and everything that we hold dear, right? That's the level of threat that these folks like to sketch. So that's the first step. And then the other step is only I can save you from this, or only my organization can stop this, or that other side, if we let them win, then everything's going to hell. So that's why you need to support so-and-so and, donate to this campaign, that sort of thing. It is instilling that the panic, the visceral feeling that you have almost everything to lose, that makes you want to do almost anything that you can to prevent that, including, by the way, compromising your own moral views. So, when Trump first came on the scene, there was this group of evangelicals who started to treat him like King Cyrus, the biblical figure. They would hold their nose at Trump's character or lack thereof. They would hold their nose at some of the policies that he had that were genuinely oppressive because they thought that he was a fighter and he was the only one who could save them from the far worse threat. And so people will sacrifice a lot when they think that everything is on the line. And that's the motivating thrust of so much of these messages.
It feels, though, in that discussion, we have pivoted from harm to threat, which are not quite the same thing, because to be harmed is something that is happening to you now. Or you can say, I have been harmed in the past, whereas a threat is you might, with some degree of probability, be harmed in the future, but you have not yet been harmed. Otherwise, it's not a threat. It's just the thing itself. But it often feels like the arguments and the way that demagogues operationalize fear and anxiety is, yes, they will point to threats. Like these changes are threatening in the sense that they will make things worse for you than things are now. But it also feels like there's a line of convincing you that you have already been harmed. It's like you weren't feeling harmed, but actually you have been. And I think this one is, for example, quite prominent among anti-market people on the left, that you think that you're doing well in our contemporary capitalist society. You think you're happy, but in actuality, you are being oppressed. You are being harmed by indoctrination into consumerism. You're your feeling of non-harm is an illusion. But that one seems kind of odd because a threat is like it makes sense for us to feel if we are harmed, it makes sense for us to feel negative emotions about that. And if there is the threat of harm, it makes sense to feel negative emotions in basically anticipation of it. But if you don't feel harmed, it seems weird to be talked into feeling actually harmed.
I think that this usually goes under the framework of raising awareness, right? And there are lots of things where raising awareness is a really valuable exercise. But a lot of the things that folks like Chris Rufo do is precisely what you just named. They try to tell you that you are being harmed in ways that you aren't currently aware of. And then, oh, by the way, if you don't act now, then the threat of further harm will be realized. So the most effective messages along these lines are, first of all, to show you that you are currently being oppressed, or your civilization is being taken away from you, or your racial purity is being degraded, or whatever the message is that people are trying to make you afraid of. Like, it's happening now. It's been happening for a long time. And oh, by the way, here's a just so story about how we got here. They love those. But then also, we have to do everything now, because if we don't, then the threat, and here I'm going to paint a really compelling picture of the threat, that is what is coming down the pike. So I think that it's always both of those. We could think through what some examples to see if there's a counterexample where it's just a threat or it's just present harm, but they travel together so often that it makes me think that they are essentially tied. And I think that you're right to point to false consciousness, because it is the exemplar of this, right? Not only are you being harmed right now, but you disagree with me claiming that you're being harmed. That's how deep the rabbit hole goes. Like, you don't even know it. And when you hear it being presented to you, you think that that's incorrect. Like, that's the most subtle and in some ways the most dangerous version of this. And every extremism has their version of it. Right? The powers that be, the elites, the Illuminati, whatever, they have just indoctrinated us so much that we can't see it. But you see this in every form of politics that doesn't accept pluralism and doesn't accept that others come to these political disagreements with reasonable views that need to be evaluated and understood.
One way to think about the harm that does in the world is that people are essentially they're being manipulated into having a dangerous emotional response to a set of information. And so the problem is the contents of the emotional response. But another way to think about it is they're having the correct emotional response to a set of information that they have, but the set of information is itself not accurate, is wrong, is painting a incorrect picture. A clear example of this is everyone's always convinced crime is going up when it's going down. And so if you genuinely believe that your city is overrun or is about to be overrun with petty criminals, then to be fearful or anxious about that is an understandable, and we'll call it correct, emotional response. And so therefore the answer to it is, the hard question is, why do people keep believing that, say, crime rates are going up when in fact they're going down? But that you could also imagine a situation where people have correct information. The city is changing, the demographics of it are changing. That's all true, but they just think there is something particularly scary or makes them anxious about being around people with a different skin color than them, or a who speak a different language than them or have different customs than them. And in that case, the underlying like factual content or informational content is true. The city actually is changing in its demographics and its complexion and its customs, but the emotional response is what we would push back on and say, hey, you shouldn't actually be fearful and scared of these differences or this change. But teasing out which is which, because people don't tend to admit that they were duped. Is that a distinction worth teasing out?
It is. And this is why I think a better understanding of sentiment broadly is really crucial. So let's take the first case, which I'll just schematically sort of call wrong information, right response. So if you think that the economy is in terrible shape and that this person who is currently president is responsible for that, it's highly rational for you to vote that person out because you think that they're hurting the economy. It just so happens that lately, both parties think that the economy is in the tank when their party is out of power. Now, that's a highly factually incorrect view, right? And so this is the sort of move that I think a lot of, especially libertarian critics of democracy have, because they look at these examples and they say, look, the people just don't understand. We have all this information, we have the data. Everybody thinks that the world generally is going to hell in a handbag. Meanwhile, poverty has dramatically reduced over the past 100 years, right? And so they roll out their charts and statistics, and the views don't change. What we call public sentiment doesn't change. And then they just throw up their hands and say, why are we giving political power to these people? So that's a real problem. But then there are also these cases, like the second one that you mentioned, where people are just having what we think of as normatively the wrong response to perfectly benign things, like people around them having different skin color, that sort of thing. And so then we have to figure out politically, what do you do about these people? Well, you probably shouldn't design institutions so that it's really easy for a small subset of the population who feels really strongly about this to gain political power, right? If you can assemble a coalition of 20 or 30% of the population and elect some sort of authoritarian who's going to send people to concentration camps, that's a bad institutional design. So on the one hand, we have to figure out how to minimize the damage that those people can do, while doing a couple other things. We also have to make sure that they fully understand the experiences of the people who they are judging, right? So this is why my own work is so interested in empathy, because what's happening in a lot of those settings is just a failure of empathy. They don't understand the lives of the people for whom they think they can legislate and decide, someone's life course. And then thirdly, we have to treat them as equals. So we can't disenfranchise them. That's not the right answer. What we need to do is to make sure that they have the chance to engage politically, just like everybody else. But our institutions are designed to accomplish the first two things to prevent them from having too much influence. So on the one hand, we need to make sure that they are the small proportion of the deciding body of voters or, deliberative assembly participants or whomever, so that their voice doesn't determine everything. And then, to the extent that we can do this in a non-coercive way, we need to create settings where they can engage others and learn about their lives and cultivate the empathy that is so difficult in modern society where, we really never have to engage with so many of these people, right? I grew up in the very rural part of Missouri where I had no Black folks in my school. I think we had like one or two Hispanic families. I didn't meet a Jewish person until I moved to college. And yet, everybody in that town felt like they knew enough about those experiences to be able to create whole political platforms that would decide a lot about how they could live. And that, I think, is the really dangerous impulse that we have to protect against.
Is this in part a problem of bigness? So if we're talking sentiments in the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith has this fantastic analogy about an earthquake in China, where he says, like imagine that he's sitting in the UK, imagining that there's an earthquake that kills an extraordinary number of people in China, which is not a place that he has any connection or at the time really awareness of. It doesn't have the global media that we have today. And he hears about this. It's a huge loss of life. He feels bad about it. But then he also, he loses his finger, so take an injury, and feels much, much worse about that because it's closer to him, even though from take a step back, you should feel much worse about the grievous harm of hundreds of thousands of people dying in an earthquake than an injury, a relatively minor injury to yourself. But that this is, we can see that. We can say like, yes, we should feel worse about China, but all of us have the experience of we feel a much, much more empathy and sympathy for people near us that we interact with, that we see eye to eye and understand on that closer level than things that are far away. And so it would seem then that just if empathy is the answer or is a way to solve these problems, if you live in a country of 350 million people who are culturally wildly diverse, geographically very far spread out, we travel much more than we did 100 or 200 years ago, but it still is the case that, I have not been to each of the 50 states or hung out in every town in America. It is harder to have empathy than to have empathy for everybody in your small town. And it feels like it's asking a lot to say the solution to our political problems is to somehow figure out how to feel empathy for all those people in China in the same way that you would feel empathy for the friend who lost a finger.
Yeah, it's such a great example. It's one of my favorite passages in Smith. So let me just highlight a couple of details from that thought experiment. First, Smith says that it's the man of humanity who is the actor in this thought experiment. So it's already somebody who, has a lot of benevolent feelings toward others. It's not a rogue or a demagogue or someone like this, right? It's somebody who wants to see others flourish. And then he notes that it's the anticipation of losing your finger. So going back to our comments about anticipation of threat and harm, right? That's what's keeping this dude up at night. So Smith understands that these things are very powerful. And Smith is also the thinker who understands so well that our sympathy has limits, right? So, he has this discussion of circles of sympathy about how we feel much closer in terms of our imaginative understanding for those near us, both geographically and emotionally, than those who are far away. So this brings us then to your question about bigness. And there are a couple ways that we might disaggregate bigness. So you mentioned it on the population scale, right? They're just all of these millions. How could we possibly understand each of their experiences? And then the issue that comes with geography is that people living in different areas have different experiences just based on where they are, right? Like your life in the middle of urban Detroit is considerably different from the day-to-day experience of somebody who's growing up in rural Iowa, for example. So how should we account for all of these things? Well, I think that it means that a smart institutional design will, on the one hand, keep things as locally centered as they can. So polycentricity makes a lot of sense here. Subsidiarity as a principle is a good idea. there are some things that you can't decide locally, right? Human rights probably have to be decided and protected at the highest level of the polity. And so there, what can you do? You just have to bring in as many voices as will be needed to help provide those deliberating about the issue understand the scope of the problem and the various alternatives. This is what we do with juries, by the way, right? We go in and we think that these 12 folks can decide a question based on their own experiences and the evidence that is presented to them. And we trust them to be able to do that because we think that people in a properly designed deliberative setting with all of the evidentiary resources can make good decisions. And I think that that is a principle that we should scale pretty dramatically across various levels of government. And recent experiments along these lines with citizens' assemblies, which have really taken off in Europe, I think are really promising on precisely this point. It turns out that when you get people in a room and you have them talk to one another about their experiences, and you bring in others to share experiences that aren't represented in the room, if that room is a representative sample of the population and you get them talking in ways that people like to talk and in productive ways, they will make good decisions. And typically those decisions are freedom enhancing and flourishing enhancing.
A lot of the ways that we could take what we've discussed today into account in the political sphere involve the structure of institutions, involve large-scale action like assemblies that you've mentioned, or other things that require a lot of time and resources and people coming together. The listeners today are just individual podcast fans who have emotions and make decisions influenced by them. What should their takeaway be as far as if taking sentiments seriously, thinking about them in politics, and just acting upon them in better ways? Like how can an individual take what we've talked about today and make steps to make the political world better without somehow waving a wand and changing institutions or assembling mass numbers of people in conversation?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is mindfulness. So much of the way that contemporary politics runs is some sort of contest for some sort of emotional reaction and response. We have cable news channels that are designed to make you feel the way that you want to feel, and you know which channel to go to based on how you want to feel. So the people who are listening to your podcast are probably a pretty mindful group, and they're probably already aware of a lot of these things. Amongst the broader population, the thing that I wish more of my friends and family understood is just how much their own emotions and reasons, so always pulling that back in because sentiment is a complex concept, understanding how those inform our decisions and not just trusting that we've arrived at our political views based on some sort of really well-reasoned viewpoint that we've sort of syllogistically come to after debating all of the different sides. Sometimes that's true, and then sometimes we just feel certain ways because we've been led to feel those ways. So mindfulness is the first point. And then I think the other thing is just humility. So knowing that my own emotions have been manipulated, which as a word has a negative connotation, and deservedly so, but my emotions have been used, shaped, formed. My responses to my emotional responses have informed a lot of political views that I have. Understanding that, I think, allows us to get a little bit more critical distance to the reactions that we see from others, especially on the other side whenever we disagree with somebody. And understanding that they're living in that same sort of emotional warfare environment. And seeing that, I think, creates that sort of connection, essentially getting back to empathy. It allows us to see things from their perspective in a way that helps us understand that we don't have everything figured out ourselves.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
David made coming to work fun. You always knew when you came into work that you were going to have an interesting conversation that day, at least one, sometimes multiple ones. And I don't think David was ever contrarian to be contrarian, but he did like to explore ideas in a way that sometimes you would start a conversation, you didn't know where it was going to end, but you knew it was going to end up someplace that was interesting. I'll never have conversations like that again, I think. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm going to miss the most. I mean, almost every morning in the last month, I've gotten up, I've read something, and wanted to send it to David for comment, so we could talk about it later that day. And realize now that I can't do that anymore. That's it's a big loss, because sometimes it would not be things about libertarianism that I would send him. It would be like University of Kentucky basketball or something. He just made life fun.
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, you can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.